Thank you for joining day one, session two of the U.S. Biochar Initiative's deep dive into the NRCS Code 336 and 808 soil carbon amendments. Here we are with our day one presentation. We're going to be starting out with Ilana, and she's leading the Farm Bill conservation programs for biochar. She's going to cover eligibility requirements and how funding is provided to the customers.
Thanks, John. This is Matt. Ilana and I and Michael agreed to switch things up just a little bit. Michael, if you can advance the automation, the animation on this slide. We wanted to give an overview of the presentation, what our goals are. First goal is understanding how the NRCS can help reimburse farmers for utilizing biochar as a soil amendment. We're going to have a module here on Farm Bill conservation programs. We want you to understand when NRCS would recommend biochar use to farmers. We'll have a module on conservation planning assistance. We want you to understand the NRCS soil carbon amendment conservation practices, and Michael is going to do a deep dive on the conservation practices for soil carbon amendment. If you can go to the next slide, the topics that we're going to cover align with what I just covered. Ilana Cohen will give the Farm Bill programs overview after I do a short introduction to NRCS. She'll be able to speak about the leading Farm Bill conservation programs for biochar, the eligibility requirements to participate in programs, and how funding is provided to customers. At the end of that, we'll take a deep dive into payment schedules and explore how the payment rates for the Farm Bill programs work. Then I'll be able to talk about conservation planning assistance, how to obtain that, and what that workflow is like. We want to emphasize that conservation plans are record decisions, and they're the gateway for programs. They're always voluntary, and they're customer objective driven. They establish connections between soil conservation problems or natural resource conservation problems and biochar or soil carbon amendment solutions. Then we'll talk about the conservation practice standards. We'll give you an overview of how NRCS builds those practice standards and how they're composed, what they're composed of, and then we'll look at the technical criteria within two conservation practice standards NRCS has published for soil carbon amendment. So for the next slide, I want to introduce those of you who have not become familiar with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service to our agency. We're a private lands focus, but we do work on some public lands and tribal lands, particularly in the Western U.S. Our mission is delivering conservation solutions so agricultural producers can protect the natural resources and feed a growing world. The agency's vision is clean and abundant water, healthy soils, resilient landscapes, and thriving agricultural communities through voluntary conservation. We support America's working lands with one-on-one personalized advice. We work voluntarily with producers and communities to find the best solutions to meet their unique conservation and business goals. We have a national web presence that has recently been updated with a clean new look and feel on our website. I visited it today to get the screen capture and look at how it features soil science and soil health, along with conservation, resource concerns, evaluation, and program ranking dates. Those are all relevant topics right there on the landing page for NRCS. So I wanted you to have that link as a reference. I think it's very contemporary and well maintained. But there's a couple of other options I want to introduce you to. The next one is called farmers.gov. Farmers.gov is a USDA sort of an enterprise-wide web-based tool that provides customers with 24/7 access to our programs and services. On the right-hand side of this slide is a screen capture of farmers.gov, and what it currently shows. Look at the things that's available here. On the top left corner, You can use the feature to locate service centers. You can type in a zip code or a city name. There is on the right top row, yourfarmers.gov account. That allows people who have registered as users and set up a private account to log in and retrieve their own records and maps for their land. There are tools in the bottom right row. It says Conservation Concerns tool. So you can learn about resource concerns, use materials there for educational purposes. And down in the near the bottom third, there's a link that says conservation, and it's got some mountains and trees in the scene on the left side of the screen where it says conservation. There are links there where a user can enter a request for assistance for NRCS. So if it's the weekend and the office is closed, or if it's after hours, when the notion comes up, farmers.gov is available to take that request. There are also abundant sources of assistance for things like loans and disaster assistance from the Farm Service Agency through farmers.gov. The next thing I wanted to do, or the last thing as by way of introduction, is to reinforce meeting NRCS locally. If you go to the next slide, our service delivery model is built around service centers that are located in the counties where you live and work and where your customers live and work. We have a local presence, and all of our services and programs are delivered locally through the USDA service centers. Those locations and staff contact information can be found using the link that I provided to the website for locating a service center. So at this point, I'm going to pause and turn the presentation back to Ilana.
Thank you so much, Matt. All right. Okay, I've turned my video on. I have no idea if it's working, but hi, everyone. My name is Ilana Cohen, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here today, and it is a learning experience for me as well. I was not very familiar with biochar before doing research before this presentation, so thank all of you as well. Okay, so I'm mostly going to talk about the primary NRCS conservation programs that we have available to support biochar. That would be the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which we call EQIP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP, and the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, or RCPP. Lots of acronyms, gotta love the government. All right, so what all of these programs do is they provide various incentive payments to farmers and foresters to implement different conservation practices on their land. And typically, this happens through program contracts that we sign with individual farms or farmers. And next slide, please. Okay, so our most well-known program is probably EQIP. And like all of our other programs, this is a voluntary and competitive program that helps farmers and foresters address various natural resource concerns that they have on their land using a national list of conservation practices and activities. The program can also help farmers meet regulatory requirements that they might need to keep abreast of at the local, state, or national level. It is a program for working land. So we do get inquiries where people want conservation assistance dollars for their grassed backyard that's not being used for really anything, and that type of land would not normally be eligible. So program for working land, and it has three main variations. There's EQIP Classic, and this is for all eligible agricultural landowners, operators like renters, and forest landowners and renters. And this program provides contracts that can be up to 10 years long, and it just gives payments for implementing conservation practices through those contracts. And then we have the EQIP Conservation Incentives Program, which is a bit newer. And this program gives 5-year contracts just for certain conservation practices, largely focusing on land management. And then lastly, we have the Conservation Innovation Grants, CIG program. And this program is intended to help drive adoption of new conservation programs. So it's a grant-based program. Next slide, please. Okay, our next best well-known program, I would say, is the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. And through this program, eligible landowners and operators can get 5-year contracts with the opportunity to renew for 5 years. But the catch is that the entire agricultural operation that producer manages needs to be enrolled. And in addition to the general eligibility requirements that we have for all of our programs, the land enrolled in CSP needs to meet certain minimum conservation eligibility requirements. And we measure that through a program called the Conservation Assessment and Ranking Tool, CART, another acronym. So we rank and select for funding applications based on the score they get in CART and based on how much funding we have available in that cycle. So CSP gives payments for conservation practices, just like with EQIP, but at a slightly lower payment rate. But it also provides payments for practice enhancements. And those are activities that build on the base practice that was already there to bring the land to a higher level of conservation. Then CSP can also pay participants for enhancement bundles, which is essentially just grouping a few different enhancements together to create more conservation than you would with those enhancements individually. And then lastly, CSP can give payments for the whole system of conservation that was in place at the time the application was submitted. Next slide, please. Okay, the last program I'll go over is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And this program is similar in terms of the meat to EQIP and CSP. However, it's project-based. And usually what happens is eligible partners will submit project proposals to our agency that we then rank and select for funding. And under the umbrella of those projects, we have individual producer contracts with the participating landowners and operators. Next slide, please. Okay, the program application process. So obviously it's completely voluntary, and we do accept applications on a year-round basis. So as long as someone meets land and participant eligibility, they can go ahead and submit an application. We would then assess and rank that application based on various criteria that's been determined at the national and state levels. And for EQIP and another program we have called the Agricultural Management Assistance Program, which is much smaller, states can decide when they want to have those funding cycles for applications and contracts. But with CSP, the funding dates are set at the national level. And if an application is selected for funding, then we would obligate the funds, meaning set aside the money, so it's reserved for that contract, and then sign the contract with the participant. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned needing to be eligible in order to submit an application. There are actually 3 types of basic program eligibility for all of our programs. The first is the applicant needs to be eligible. And that means they need to meet AGI, adjusted gross income requirements. They need to file a farm operating plan and have farm records established with the Farm Service Agency. And they need to meet highly erodible land and wetland conservation requirements. Second, we have land eligibility requirements. And that generally just means that the land needs to be either agricultural or forested. Again, it needs to be some kind of working land that we're enrolling here. And rented land is completely welcome, but the applicant does need to show that they're going to be able to maintain control of that rented land throughout the contract period. There's just an easy form that the landowner needs to sign at the beginning, and that's it. And then finally, we have resource concern eligibility, and this one is the one that people forget about sometimes. For land to be eligible, there need to be resource concerns on that land that we can help address through conservation practices that we identify in that conservation plan that we build with the participants. And as long as there's at least one, then we're good to go. Next slide, please. All right, so Congress has identified historically underserved producers, basically people that can be eligible for extra benefits under our programs. So that includes beginning farmers and ranchers, limited resource farmers and ranchers, socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, and veteran farmers and ranchers. And these historically underserved producers can be eligible for extra program benefits. For example, they get priority consideration for funding. They have special funding that's set aside. And if you happen to be a veteran and a beginning or socially disadvantaged producer, then you can get even higher priority. And finally, EQIP and AMA will provide both higher payment rates and advanced payments to historically underserved participants. Next slide, please. Okay, so payment schedules. I've always thought this was a little inaptly named. It's really payment rates. Essentially, we have a whole team of economists that figure out what payments NRCS is going to be making to participants for each of the conservation practices each year. So, for example, you're applying your biochar to the soil. Here's how much money we're going to give you for every cubic yard. And the economists incorporate all the real world costs of supplies and labor, and they're set at the national level, but they are adjusted regionally because obviously all of those costs vary across the country. So when you apply, we'll determine which year's payment schedules, which are really payment rates, would apply to you. And I believe that is my last slide. So I'm happy to answer questions, John, if that is what you would like me to do now.
So I think we'll probably just start. I think we'll start at the last question and then work backward. What demonstrates socially disadvantaged women farmers?
Starting with the tough question. So we actually have participants self-certify as socially disadvantaged. So socially disadvantaged, I believe, is it's ethnicities and races that have traditionally encountered prejudice. So we ask that participants or applicants self-certify as socially disadvantaged. I don't believe that our programs include being a woman as a socially disadvantaged category. I know other federal programs do. But again, so it would be those races and ethnicities, and you would self-certify, and there's no checking on that. It's on our system.
Okay, that sounds good. Another question is, can you identify eligibility for nonprofits?
Nonprofits are eligible, so they would need to meet the other types of eligibility I laid out, land and resource concern, but absolutely eligible.
Let's see. Here's one. Would a golf course be eligible for some of these programs? So, for example, if they were privately held, I guess we should understand the difference between privately held and municipal held.
Well, when we say working lands, we do mean agricultural or forested, not usually working in some other capacity. However, I'm sure there are golf courses that could make a case that they're eligible based on maybe they have special programs, maybe they have habitat planted for pollinators. I would say that is a great question to ask your local NRCS office. And if they're not sure, they'll elevate it to my team, the policy branch. And we'll tell you. If somebody has one, let's tell them to try and go through it and let us know how it goes. Another one, I mean, you touched on the viable lands. So if there's grassland, about 20 acres of grassland not in active production, or something like 10 acres of non-commercial woodlands, would that be something that might qualify? It very much depends, because it also depends on the cropping history of the land in question. So sometimes land used to be agricultural and now it's been just left alone, and sometimes that can be eligible. So again, I would go to your local NRCS office on that one. Okay, how about orchards? Are they eligible? Yep. Okay. So for applications to the program, is there a template and form to fill out to start? And if so, where do we find those? NRCS website, absolutely. We have a fairly simple PDF application that you can download and fill out. Okay, and I'm guessing Michael probably covers that a little bit more in his talk. Oh, here's a good one. Would a commercial composting operation be considered for funding for conservation practices? That is a great question. I am not certain, actually. It would depend. on the specifics. Sorry to always give that very bureaucratic answer.
No, that's understandable. I think one of the things that might be appealing is that inside of 336, since it does fund both compost and biochar, that compost producers that enhance their compost may find that they have a larger customer base at scale. It would seem to make sense because you've got your nutrition and your carbon, right, mixed together. Plus, the science shows that incorporating biochar into compost reduces the methane emissions by 80%. So it's kind of a win-win. So we'd encourage you to give it a try. Let's see. Does the NRCS work with forest owners?
Absolutely, every day.
Okay. Here's a good question that we get a lot. If a landowner produces and places their own biochar on their land, is it eligible? Or is there a verification process for such a practice?
That would absolutely be eligible. We verify everything. So we come out and make sure that the conservation practices that have been scheduled have in fact been implemented before we hand out our payments.
That's actually fantastic to know, because I had a biochar producer ask me that exact question yesterday because he's got a couple hundred acres. How about utilization for reclamation efforts? So say like mine site reclamation, would that qualify? Like if they're trying to restore the soils and then maybe using phytoremediation, perhaps. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's much of a. I know it's a needed area, but it's not much to deal with the scale that NRCS is kind of looking for. So
well, we actually don't have a size minimum, so it wouldn't be that. But it just sounds like that wouldn't be agricultural. That would be more land restoration. So I might consider that producer to look to EPA or one of the other federal agencies that help with land conservation that isn't necessarily agricultural in nature.
Okay, so that leads up to a really, we actually have several questions in here about CSAs and the small scale backyard community gardeners. They're asking if this is something that they can apply for. I think I did hear somebody once mention that a number of CSAs might get together to form a co-op and then apply as a co-op.
They have the choice to do it either way. We've always welcomed operations of all sizes, big and small, but in recent years, there's been an added emphasis on making sure our policy is small farm friendly. So you're not going to be outcompeted by a big operation just because you're a small operation. And please apply, and we're very happy to assist CSAs and small family farms. And even if you just have a backyard in the suburbs, but you're using it for farming somehow, you're probably eligible to apply.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that answer. I'm going to go back up to the top for the earliest questions, and some of the questions are, is there an income limitation for the EQIP grants? And then Albert says that the EQIP addresses client concerns for conservation from practices on an approved list. Is biochar on that list? If not, how do we get it on that list? Seems that it is with this conversation.
So I believe Matt will be talking about that, but I think it is on the list. And then in terms of income, yes, that's where the producer eligibility AGI limitation comes in, and Congress sets that income level. I think it's pretty high, but you can't necessarily qualify for our programs if you're, Bill Gates.
Right. Okay. Here's a good question. Will the Inflation Reduction Act influence funding or ranking for biochar relative to other practices?
Oh, great question. Well, the Inflation Reduction Act has certainly given us an infusion of funding. So we're hoping to get more conservation dollars on the ground to help our farmers and foresters. I am not sure if biochar is on the list of approved, we're calling them climate smart practices. I can definitely find out, and I believe that list is publicly available or will be soon.
Yeah, I had in a previous conversation, I've been led to believe that the typical adoption funding ratio is about 1 to 3, and it's expected that maybe with IRA, the boost from IRA, we might see as many as 50% of all applications being accepted. So I think that's interesting. Hopefully, we can get a little more foresight. Let's see. Here's a good one from Elizabeth. If all of these, oh, never mind. I'm going to take a moment just to point out what Elizabeth added in the Q&A. She's saying, if all this sounds confusing, reach out to your county NRCS county conservationist. They can help you. They can introduce you to FSA staff to help you with the eligibility paperwork. So, and she had a link. What we'll do is we'll reference that link and put it and provide it with some additional documents. Okay, so what counts as a resource concern that justifies the use of biochar? If a farmer wants to amend with biochar for its carbon sequestration benefits, does climate change atmospheric CO2 constitute a resource concern?
I think definitely, especially after the IRA, yes. Resource concerns are pretty broad. So it can be something like using less water or less energy in your operation, or applying less fertilizer. Basically anything you can think of that would help the environment. And in fact, sometimes someone comes to us with a really great idea, but it's not on our approved list, and we have mechanisms in place to get new practices added to the approved list. So don't be shy.
Okay, so here's a practical question. What would be an expected timeline or range for the timeline from enrollment of a grower into the EQIP program to the conservation plan development and finally to the application of biochar compost?
Oh,
do we have any practice? Yeah, do we have any practice scenarios that we've seen?
I think Matt is talking about that.
Okay. I'll place a marker in that. And how does the operation of size influence eligibility? So I think we have some folks with larger acreage here and they're curious about it.
It doesn't. So all sizes welcome, as I said.
Everyone's welcome. That's what we like to see. Okay, somebody, Trip is asking for more details on eligibility requirements, specifically for adjusted gross income, but also the maximum amount of dollars that a producer or farmer is eligible for during the farm bill cycle. That is a good question, because I know that people are wondering like how much and when and how frequently.
So that AGI limitation is set by Congress. So I think you could just Google it. I'm actually not sure what the specific limit is right now. For EQIP, you can get $450,000 per farm bill cycle right now. So it's a lot. And I think CSP, it might be 200. I'm kind of an EQIP specialist, but I believe it's 200.
Do you have a magic ball for the EQIP? Can we figure out maybe if that's going to get boosted, that $450,000 ceiling? Because you could burn through that pretty quick if you had even 500 acres. And then you wouldn't be able to apply it with a bunch of your other programs that you need for on farm.
Well, I should say that is the limit per person. So if you have, you can have
entity?
Sorry?
Is it per entity? So if you're a company, your business, and you own a number of lands, is it per acreage allocation, or is it per entity, business entity?
No person can get more than the 450, but I believe entities can get up to 900,000, as long as that would be split between at least two people.
All right, and then can they pursue other grant opportunities through RCPP?
Yeah.
Okay, and is there the same limit on that, or is it there's no known ceiling on RCPP?
You know what? I'm not sure. RCPP is actually managed by a different branch and not the policy branch.
Okay.
But you can definitely pursue more than one program at once. But one thing to keep in mind, we won't pay money for the same conservation practices implemented on the same land at the same time, because that's double dipping. But if you have an operation that is large or complex enough that you can participate in multiple programs at once and avoid duplication, then you can absolutely earn those extra dollars.
Okay, so I think there's a question that's basically saying, what's our limit when we're trying to purchase biochar? Like, do we have to pay the full rate to the biochar producer and then get reimbursed, or do the feds, does the grant pay the producer directly? And at what percentage? Or is this a Michael question?
I think Matt and Michael are going to be showing the specific payment schedules, payment rates for the biochar
Okay.
practices. But in general, we give payments directly to producers. There is a way if you want us to give the payment to someone else, but it means more paperwork. So usually the participants just get the payment directly and then they can use it to offset their purchases and whatnot.
All right. Tell you what, let's just do just a few more questions and then we'll move on. And oh yeah, it's Tom is pointing out, Horton is pointing out that biochar is included in the USDA Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. So,
Great.
and he posted a link. So thank you for that, Tom. And oh, here's a good question. Can you qualify if you've already been using biochar on your land? I'm gonna add my assumption here, and that's if you've already applied it before your application process for the grant funding, that they're going to say, no, you don't. We can't pay you for something you already did, but we could pay you for future addendums of biochar.
Right. We won't pay for past work, but we'll pay for future.
Okay, so they would still, so they would qualify. That's good. And let's see. So a question about a farmer that might be leasing their land that's not in production, but they want to build it up so that they can put it into production. So as a rehabilitation process, would they be able to qualify for funding if that's the desired goal?
It gets a little bit tricky when it comes to new operations. And I'm sure everyone on this call can understand this challenge, but NRCS wants to help bring land to a higher level of conservation, right? So if currently the land is being left alone and maybe it has native grasses and it's great pollinator habitat and you suddenly want to row crop it, obviously that's a more intensive use of the land. So you're actually decreasing conservation. By the same token, with our help, you might be able to do that in a way that is less harmful than it might otherwise be. So normally for new operations or operations that are moving to a more intensive use, for example, you're going from grazing to cropping, we won't provide you with financial assistance to essentially reduce the conservation on your land. We'll provide you with technical assistance to ensure you're doing that in the most conservation friendly way possible. But then once that operation is in existence, once the agriculture or forestry is happening, then you suddenly have resource concerns. So the next application cycle, you would then be eligible for our program. So it's a little bit of a delicate balance, but we want to help where we can, but we won't pay for land to be taken to a more intensive use.
Okay. So we've had a number of questions about tree planting and reforestation, and both wildlands and urban. Is there a way that 336 or 808 could be applied to these efforts? It's difficult because it's not like established. It's if it's a property, it might be, it's established land and they might be using it for wind barriers and things like that, or just general nature-based carbon sinks. But urban, it's such a diversified location and you're using such a small amount, I'd kind of be surprised.
I would again take those questions to your local NRCS office. Every operation is unique, and honestly, states sometimes interpret our policies, our national policies, in different ways. So what I say as a national person might not even apply in a state. So I would talk to your local NRCS office.
Okay, let's see. This is a really good one, and I'm sure. Well, go ahead.
I've been seeing a question, one of the only ones I can see, about whether a participant would own the rights to any environmental attributes.
So like their carbon credits.
Right. You would own those. And we have no problem with you earning additional income through selling your carbon credits or anything else. I'm not sure about the Forest Service. I was over there briefly several years ago, and I think they have I think that they might have the same policy, but at least with NRCS, we make no claim to any environmental credits. And as long as you are following our rules, then enter those markets and sell away.
Okay. And we actually have a number of questions in the Q&A around biochar production equipment and whether or not this funds that, so that the way they can produce and install their own biochar. My understanding is that that is not a funding opportunity through 336. But it's best to hear it from you, or maybe Michael or Matt.
Probably Michael and Matt on that one.
Yeah. You know, there's some very limited funding on production of the equipment. We'd have to come back to that. I think that's a subject for another webinar. So, all right. Well, I think this has been a really fantastic Q&A. I feel like I'm taking up a lot of your time. We're about an hour into the program. I think what we'll do is, how about, should we, did the two of you do the back-to-back? So you and Matt did back-to-back, is that accurate?
Right, so Matt is taking over now, and then I believe it's Michael's turn. So I'm happy to keep answering questions. It's just down to how you want to manage the time.
All right, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it. And this wraps up session 2 of day 1 on the NRCS Code 336 Soil Carbon Amendment. Special thanks to Ilana, Cohen, and team for the excellent information and Q&A. Next on session 3, Matt Flint will review payment scenarios and then tie it into conservation planning, implementation, and evaluation. Thank you to our sponsors, which make programs like this possible. Please contact USBI about sponsoring future programs. Thank you, and look below, like, subscribe, and share.